Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a little trip back in time. Way back. We're heading to a place that's both incredibly familiar in its human energy and yet terrifyingly alien in its details, a major medieval European city. And let's be honest, dropped into the real thing with your modern sensibilities and probably very clean shoes, you might not make it past the first day. But that's why we're doing this from the comfort of our beds. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're at it, drop a comment letting me know what city you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always cool to see where everyone is in the world as we start these journeys. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing that hits you isn't a sight but a feeling, the gentle, rhythmic rocking of a small wooden boat. You're on the water, the River Thames, and the air is cool and damp. Ahead through the grey mist, a silhouette begins to take shape, not of skyscrapers but of 1,000 pointed rooftops and the immense, commanding spire of a cathedral piercing the clouds. This is London. The year is, let's say, 1450th. As you draw closer, the famous London Bridge resolves out of the fog. It's not just a bridge, it's a living street, crammed with teetering, multi-story houses and shops built right on top of it. A chaotic architectural marvel that seems to defy gravity. The river is a highway, thick with boats of all sizes, from tiny skiffs to larger merchant vessels. Their masts are dense, leafless forests. Your boatman navigates the chaos and nudges the hull against a muddy bank near a set of stone steps. He grunts, pointing. Time to disembark. You hand him a coin and step out, and your foot sinks an inch into something soft and foul-smelling. Welcome to the city. The second thing that hits you is the smell. It's an overwhelming, complex perfume that your 21st century nose is entirely unprepared for. There's the ever-present damp earth and mud, the sharp tang of wood smoke from 100 chimneys, the scent of livestock, yes. There are pigs and chickens wandering in the laneways, and underneath it all, the pervasive, sickly sweet odor of human waste. But it's not all bad. You catch a sudden, wonderful whiff of baking bread from a nearby baker's oven, and the smell of roasting meat from a cookshop. It's the smell of life, unfiltered and intense. Then comes the sound. It's a cacophony. The clang-clang of a blacksmith's hammer from a nearby forge, the rhythmic thud of a woodworker's mallet, the shouts of merchants hawking their wares. Fresh oysters, good wool, cheap pies, hot pies. Church bells ring out, marking the hour, a constant, holy soundtrack to the secular chaos below. The rumble of wooden cart wheels on uneven cobblestones, the squawk of a startled goose, and the endless hum of human voices, speaking a form of English that sounds thick and strange to your ears, full of unfamiliar words and lilting cadences. You start to walk, pulling your cloak tighter around you. The streets are narrow, more like alleyways, and the timber-framed houses lean in towards each other overhead, their upper floors jutting out so far that they almost touch, blocking out what little sunlight there is. It creates a perpetual twilight down at street level. You have to watch your step constantly, avoiding puddles of who knows what, discarded bones, and other refuse. Yet, amidst this mess, you notice a man with a cart and a wide rake, a city official known as a raker, dutifully scraping the worst of the filth into a pile. It's a small, almost futile gesture of civic order against an overwhelming tide of mess. A fascinating little detail, showing that they were trying, in their own way, to keep things clean. It wasn't just accepted squalor. It was a constant, losing battle. You find yourself pressed on all sides by the crowd. A wealthy merchant in a fur-lined coat pushes past you, followed by a servant. A pair of friars in simple brown robes walk by, heads bowed. A woman balances a large basket of laundry on her head with impossible grace. You try to carve out a little personal space, but it's a fool's errand. Historians still debate the exact population density and the lived experience of medieval urban life. Estimates for London at this time hover around 60,000 souls crammed into a single square mile. But how that number translates to the feeling of your daily personal bubble, or the complete lack thereof, is something they try to piece together from old court records about arguments and archaeological digs. Standing here, pressed between a fishwife and a man carrying a live chicken. You feel you could give them a definitive answer. Your personal bubble is zero. It doesn't exist. You are just one more body in the great, jostling, breathing organism of the city. You've been here less than an hour, and you already feel exhausted, anonymous, and desperate for a roof over your head and a warm drink. You need to find an inn, a place to rest. You stop a passerby, using the simplest words you can muster, and ask where a traveler might find lodging and maybe some entertainment. He gives you a knowing, slightly crooked smile and points you south toward the riverbank again, but to a very specific district just across the bridge. A place with a reputation. You follow the man's gesture, heading south across the famous London Bridge. This isn't just a crossing, it's a journey into another state of being. On the city side behind you, the bells of street poles still peal with pious regularity. The commerce feels well, if not entirely wholesome, at least straightforward. Wool, fish, iron goods. Here, on the bridge itself, the shops are smaller, selling trinkets, souvenirs for pilgrims, and cheap food. The press of the crowd is just as thick. You have to flatten yourself against a wall as a knight on horseback, his squire trailing behind, forces his way through the throng with an air of absolute entitlement. The air changes as you near the southern bank, the side known as Southwark. It smells more of river mud, cheap ale, and something else, a kind of faint, pervasive perfume mixed with damp straw. You're leaving the formal jurisdiction of the City of London proper and entering a liberty, an area with its own distinct laws and administration. And as you walk, a question starts to form in your mind, a genuine, nagging paradox. You just came from a city utterly dominated by the symbols of Christianity, a place where sin and damnation are not abstract concepts, but are preached from the pulpit every Sunday, depicted in terrifying detail on church walls, and used as the justification for law and order. How then can a place with a reputation not only exist, but be openly pointed to by a stranger on the street? How can such a profoundly God-fearing society tolerate a district dedicated to what they would surely call vice and fleshly sin? The answer, you're about to discover, is one of the most bizarre and pragmatic pieces of mental gymnastics in history. It was just tolerated, it was considered, by some of the most influential thinkers of the age, to be absolutely essential. The concept is a necessary evil. Imagine you're a city leader. You're responsible for the soul's safety and stability of 60,000 people crammed into 1 square mile. You believe with every fiber of your being that male lust is an unstoppable, chaotic force of nature. It's a raging river. If you try to dam it up completely, you know it will eventually burst its banks and flood the entire city. It won't just disappear, it will spill out into the respectable streets. It will lead to the seduction of honest merchants' daughters, the violation of virtuous wives, and widespread adultery that threatens the sacred family lines and inheritance. Even worse, from their theological standpoint, it could lead men toward what they considered the far greater sin of sodomy, an act deemed an abomination against God's natural order. So what do? You don't try to stop the river. Instead, you build a canal. A carefully managed, well-regulated, officially sanctioned channel to divert the dangerous floodwater away from the pristine palace. You build a sewer to carry away the filth so the rest of the city can remain clean. This grim but powerful metaphor was famously used by the great church father, St. Augustine of Hippo. He wrote, and I'm paraphrasing here, that if you get rid of prostitutes, you'll just end up spreading lust and chaos everywhere else. He compared them to a cesspool in a palace, foul but necessary to keep the main halls from stinking. Thomas Aquinas, another titan of Christian thought, echoed this sentiment centuries later. It's a stunning admission. Society, in order to protect its honorable women and its own rigid structure, must sacrifice a class of dishonorable ones. This is the strange, cold logic that governs the place you're about to enter. It's not a den of thieves operating in the shadows, hunted by the law. It's a public utility, a civic institution, a pressure valve for the city's boiling pot of male desire. And this is a good place to mention a fascinating little piece of trivia, because this system was seen as a bulwark for social order. The authorities were deeply involved. They didn't just turn a blind eye, they wrote the rulebook, the operating hours, and the codes of conduct. A sin, yes, but a bureaucratized, predictable, and most importantly, taxable sin. Historians, of course, still debate the true motivations behind this system. Was it genuinely a paternalistic, if deeply flawed, attempt to protect the majority of women from assault and to maintain social peace? Or was it more about a deep-seated anxiety over controlling male behavior and, more cynically, a way to institutionalize a patriarchy that designated some women as public property status of others? Was it about social engineering? Or was it just about making money from a human impulse that was never going to go away? There are no easy answers, and the documents that survive often focus on the dry, practical matters of regulation and rent, not the philosophical angst. You've now crossed the bridge entirely. You're in Southwark. The atmosphere is palpably different. The streets are muddier, the buildings a little more ramshackle. The laughter from the tavern sounds louder, less restrained. You're standing at the entrance to a small network of alleyways. This is it. The place the man pointed you to. The officially sanctioned sewer of London. Now you just need to figure out what to call it. You wouldn't ask for a brothel or a red light district. The local slang is something far more domestic. You approach a man who looks like a local, a dockworker with broad shoulders and a weary face, who's leaning against a damp brick wall. You clear your throat, trying to sound casual, and ask where a man might find companionship. You stumble over the words, trying to find a polite, or at least a functional euphemism. He looks you up and down, sizing you up, then lets out a short, gruff laugh. "Looking for the stews, are you?" he asks, his accent thick. "Just head down that lane there, mate." Stews? The word hangs in the air, utterly bizarre to your modern ears. It conjures images of bubbling pots of meat and vegetables, of a hearty, warming meal. And in a way, you're not entirely wrong. It's a perfect example of how language evolves in strange and unexpected ways. This famous, or infamous, district in Southwark was known as the Liberty of the Clink, but everyone on the street just called it the Stews. The name wasn't originally a metaphor for a place where men could get hot and steamy. It was literal. Centuries before, in the 12th century, this area was home to public bathhouses. In an era when private baths were a luxury for the ultra-rich, these were communal facilities, places where you could go to get clean, soak in hot water, and socialize. They were, essentially, the medieval equivalent of a spa. The stewing was the act of soaking in a hot tub or a steam room. So you walk down the lane he indicated, your mind puzzling over this connection. The ground is even muddier here, a mix of dirt, straw, and refuse that squelches under your boots. The alley is narrow, the overhanging buildings creating a tunnel-like effect. It's midday, but it feels like twilight in here. You pass a rowdy tavern, the sound of drunken singing spilling out into the lane, and then you see them. A series of houses, perhaps a dozen or so, all in a row. They don't look dramatically different from other buildings you've seen, perhaps a little more weathered, a bit more run down. But there's a subtle distinction. Above each door is a small painted sign, not with words as many people couldn't read, but with symbols: a swan, a bell, a cross of keys, a boar's head. These were the names of the individual houses. This is where the history gets a bit murky and amusing. Initially, the bathhouses were just that, bathhouses. But it seems human nature did its thing. Offering a hot bath and a scrub was one service, and soon other, more personal services began to be offered on the side. It was a natural, if not entirely respectable, business evolution. Over time, the bathing part of the business became less and more of a flimsy pretext for the main event. By your time, the mid-15th century, everyone knew what going to the stews really meant, even if the name itself was a fossil from a more innocent, or at least more covert era. A little-known fact that adds to the irony: some historical accounts suggest that these establishments were eventually forbidden from actually offering hot baths, as it was seen as a potential health hazard and a fire risk. So you have a district called the Stews where you probably couldn't even get a decent bath anymore. You pause, looking at the row of signed doorways. You now understand the name, but the reality is still sinking in. This isn't a shadowy, illegal enterprise. It's an officially recognized part of the city's geography. These aren't just random houses of ill repute, they are licensed, named businesses. The number of these official houses was, in fact, fixed by law. For a long time, there were 18 of them. Then the number was reduced to 12. The authorities weren't trying to stamp them out, they were trying to contain them, to make sure the stew houses stayed within their designated zone and didn't spill out into the rest of Southwark. The existence of these signs, these official names, brings up a point that historians love to debate: the extent of literacy and symbolic communication in the Middle Ages. For a largely illiterate populace, symbols were everything. A knight had his coat of arms, a guild had its emblem, and a pub had its sign. It's fascinating, and a bit comical, to realize that the brothels of London were a part of this same visual, symbolic language. The sign of the bell or the swan wasn't a secret code, it was an advertisement, as clear and direct as a glowing neon sign would be in a later era. It was integrated into the normal visual fabric of the city. You take a deep breath. The air is thick with the smell of cheap ale and wood smoke. You can hear faint laughter, a woman's voice, coming from one of the open doorways. This whole setup, the pragmatic necessary evil philosophy, the bizarre historical name, the officially sanctioned and advertised nature of it all, is a dizzying mix of piety and practicality, of sin and civic planning. You found the stews, but before you can even consider which of these symbolic doors to approach, you realize there's a much bigger, more shocking piece of the puzzle you haven't yet uncovered. Who owns the land you're currently standing on? Who is the landlord of this entire, sordid, yet highly regulated district? The answer is the most potent symbol of medieval hypocrisy you could possibly imagine. You're standing there in the muddy lane, contemplating the signs, the bell, the swan, the boar's head, when a figure catches your eye. HES walking with a sense of purpose, carrying a ledger and a small leather satchel that jingles faintly with the sound of coins. He's not a brawler or a drunkard, nor is he a potential customer. HES dressed in respectable dark wool, the attire of a clerk or a steward. He stops at the first house, the bell knocks firmly, and the door is opened by a stout-looking woman who gives him a deferential nod. He makes a notation in his ledger, she drops a few coins into his satchel, and he moves on to the next house, HES collecting rent. Your curiosity piqued, you cautiously approach another bystander, a man whittling a piece of wood on a doorstep, and you ask him who the man with the book is. The whittler squints at the retreating figure. That's the bishop's man, he says, as if it's the most normal thing in the world. He spits on the ground. Come for his due, he has. The words hit you like a physical blow. The bishop's man. You must have misheard. Surely he means the man works for some lord who happens to be named Bishop, or perhaps it's a local nickname. You press him, the bishop. You mean of the church. The man gives you a look that's a mixture of pity and amusement at your ignorance. I, the Bishop of Winchester. This air is his land, his liberty. Always has been. Let that sink in. The ground beneath your feet, this entire district dedicated to officially sanctioned sin, is the property of one of the most powerful and wealthy clergymen in all of England. The Bishop of Winchester, a successor to the Apostles, a prince of the Holy Mother Church, is the landlord of London's red light district. This isn't an exaggeration or a Protestant's mere campaign from a later century. It's a well-documented historical fact. The liberty of the clink where the stews were located was part of the manor of Southwark, which had been owned by the Diocese of Winchester since the 12th century. The bishop was, for all intents and purposes, the ultimate authority here. He held court, his officials enforced the rules, and most importantly, his treasury collected the rents and the fines. This arrangement was so old and so established that no one even questioned it. It was just the way things were. This is the peak of the necessary evil argument, twisted into a bizarre business model. The church on the one hand preached that lust was a deadly sin and that fornication would lead your soul to eternal damnation. Priests would thunder from the pulpit about the evils of the flesh. Yet, on the other hand, at least one very prominent part of that same church was not only tolerating prostitution but actively profiting from it. They were, quite literally, making a living from the very sin they condemned. It's a contradiction so profound that it's almost funny. You can imagine the bishop's treasurer meticulously counting out the coins from the stewhouses, the sin tax, and then using that same money to fund the construction of a new chantry chapel or to buy more luxurious vestments for mass. This is where we get a little known but fantastic piece of historical slang. The women who worked in the stews were often called Winchester Geese. It was a wry, cynical nod to their powerful, pious landlord. They belonged to him just like the geese on his other, more conventional manors. Historians are still entangling the knots of this relationship. How did a man of God justify this to himself? The official line, of course, would have been the standard necessary evil argument. By containing the sin on his land and regulating it heavily, the bishop was performing a civic duty. He was preventing greater chaos from erupting in London. He was, in a twisted way, a shepherd protecting the wider flock by fencing off a few of its members. The regulations he imposed were famously strict. We'll get into those later, and were probably seen as a way of mitigating the sinfulness of the enterprise. But it's hard to ignore the steady, reliable stream of income it provided. The church was a massive landowner and a political powerhouse. It operated in the real world of finance and power, and the income from the liberty of the clink was a valuable asset. You look back at the rent collector, now knocking on the door of the Swan. The transaction is the same, a nod and the ledger, the jingle of coins. It's so mundane, so bureaucratic. The sin has been laundered through paperwork and transformed into legitimate episcopal income. You can almost hear the gears of cognitive dissonance grinding away. The system allowed the bishop to remain spiritually clean while his purse got heavier. His hands weren't directly touching the money exchanged to the act itself, merely the rent for the property where the act took place. It's a fine distinction, a theological loophole big enough to sail a barge through. You suddenly feel a strange sense of disillusionment. The world, which had seemed so black and white from the sermons, God and the devil, sinner and saint, is, in reality, a messy, compromised, hypocritical shade of grey. The very institution that defines sin is profiting from it. It's a revelation that's more shocking than the mud, the smells, or the chaos of the city. Before you work up the nerve to actually approach one of these houses, you realize you need to know the rules. If the bishop is the landlord, there must be rules. And in medieval society, there were rules for everything. All right, so you've processed the shocking revelation that you're standing on holy ground, sort of. The Bishop of Winchester is the landlord, which means this whole operation isn't the Wild West. It's more like a highly regulated, slightly depressing theme park of vice. And like any well-run institution, it has a thick book of rules. You, as a potential customer, are expected to know and follow them. This isn't just about good manners, it's about law and order in the liberty. Breaking the rules could land you in the Clink prison, which, conveniently, is located right here in the same district and is also managed by the bishop's men. Vertical integration, you see. So before you even think about knocking on a door with a picture of a boar's head on it, let's go over the customer handbook. You learn this by listening to the local chatter, by observing, and by asking a few discreet questions of a man who seems to be acting as a doorman or a guard. First rule, and it's a big one, no first entry. You can't just barge into a house. You must be invited in. This seems like a small point, but it was legally significant. It meant the women inside had some, and I stress some semblance of control over who entered their workspace. Similarly, once you're done with your business, you are not allowed to linger. The regulations stated that a man should void the house and not tarry after the fact, and men becoming overly attached or possessive. It was a transaction, and the rules were designed to keep it that way. Second, and this one is quite specific, you were not allowed to bring your weapons. In a society where many men, especially those of a certain class, were armed with at least a dagger, this was a crucial rule for preventing bloodshed. The doorman or the board, the manager of the house, would likely ask you to leave your sword or knife at the door. Fights were bad for business, and a dead customer was a bureaucratic nightmare for the bishop's administration. Third, money matters. Everything was, in theory, supposed to be upfront. You couldn't run up a tab. The regulations stipulated that a woman should not trust any man. You paid for what you wanted, and that was that. If you tried to leave without paying your due, you'd be in serious trouble. This wasn't just a civil dispute, it was a crime within the liberty. The board could have you dragged before the bishop's court. A fascinating little tidbit from the historical record shows just how seriously this was taken. Some regulations stated that if a man tried to abscond without paying, the woman was legally permitted to draw blood on him to mark him as a debtor. It's a rather vivid image, isn't it? A state-sanctioned scratching post. Fourth, there were rules about who could be a customer. This is where it gets a bit murky and class-based. While in theory open to many, certain men were forbidden. For instance, married men were technically not supposed to be there, a rule that was, you can imagine, almost impossible to enforce and likely ignored by everyone. More seriously, men of the cloth, priests, monks, friars were strictly forbidden from entering the stews. This was a rule the church was extremely serious about, for obvious reasons. A priest caught in a stew house was a scandal of the highest order. Whether this rule was effective is, of course, a matter historians still debate. The sheer number of times it's mentioned in documents suggests it was a persistent problem. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, you had no right to abuse or mistreat the women. The official ordinances, established under the bishop's authority, explicitly forbade violence against the Winchester Geese. A man who beat or harmed a woman could be fined or imprisoned. Now, this sounds progressive, and in a way, it was. But it's crucial to understand the logic behind it. The primary motivation was probably not a modern, humanistic concern for the woman's well-being. These women, working in the bishop's licensed houses, were a source of income. Damaging them was like damaging any other piece of rental property. It was a pragmatic rule to ensure the long-term viability of the business. It offered a layer of protection, yes, but it was a protection rooted in commerce, not compassion. So there you are, standing in the alley, armed with this new knowledge. Don't force your way in. Leave your dagger at the door. Pay up front. Don't be a priest, and don't be a brute. It all sounds so orderly, so bureaucratic. The sin is not in the act itself, which is tacitly accepted, but in breaking the established protocol. You can go to hell for the fornication, but you'll go to the clink prison for not paying for it. It's a fascinatedly medieval way of looking at the world, a place where earthly and divine just separate onto completely separate, though sometimes overlapping tracks. You watch as a small group of young men, probably apprentices with a bit of coin in their pockets, swagger up to one of the doors. They knock, and after a brief exchange, they leave their knives with a tough-looking man at the entrance and disappear inside. It all happens smoothly, a well-oiled, routine transaction. The system works. Now you know the rules for the customers. But what about the door? What about the people on the other side of the door? What about the one who holds the keys, connects the money, and enforces these rules inside the house? Your attention is now drawn to the figure who orchestrates this whole performance, the board. You decide to take a step closer, your curiosity getting the better of your caution. You linger near the doorway of one of the houses, the cross keys, trying to peer into the dimly lit interior without being too obvious. The door is ajar, and inside you can see a large common room, a fire crackling in a hearth, casting long, dancing shadows on the wattle and daub walls. And in the center of it all, like a spider in its web, is a figure who commands the entire room, probably in her late 40s or 50s, with a stern face and sharp, intelligent eyes that seem to miss nothing. This is the board, the manager, the madam, and let's be clear, she is not just an employee. In the ecosystem of the stews, she is a power broker. The term board has come down to us with purely negative connotations, a word dripping with sleaze and exploitation. And while there was certainly an element of that, the reality in the regulated system of the stews was far more complex. The board wasn't some shadowy criminal. She was, essentially, a licensed business operator, recognized by the authorities of the liberty. Though it was a role predominantly held by women, was the one who leased the stew house directly from the bishop's administration. She was the one responsible for paying the rent on time and for ensuring that all the many regulations were followed to the letter within her establishment. You watch her in action. A young man, one of the apprentices you saw earlier, gets a little too loud, emboldened by ale. He grabs a serving girl's arm a little too roughly. Before anyone else can react, the board is there. She doesn't shout. She speaks in a low, firm voice, and the apprentice immediately lets go, his face flushing with embarrassment. She has an authority that in these four walls. She is the law. If a customer causes trouble, she is the one who has the right to throw him out. If a fight breaks out, it's her job to stop it. If a client refuses to pay, she's the one who initiates the process of having him arrested and thrown in the clink. Her role is a balancing act of incredible difficulty. On the one hand, she must be welcoming to customers, creating an atmosphere that encourages them to spend their money. On the other, she must be a strict disciplinarian, protecting her geese from harm and ensuring the house doesn't turn a bad reputation with the bishop's men for being too rowdy. A reputation for trouble could mean fines or, even worse, the loss of her license to operate, which would be a financial catastrophe. So who were these women? How did one become a board? This is a point where the historical records are often frustratingly silent, forcing historians to piece together clues. Most were likely former prostitutes themselves, women who had survived the brutal realities of the trade and, through a combination of business acumen, toughness, and perhaps a bit of luck, had managed to save enough money to lease their own establishment. They understood the business from the inside out. They knew the clients and they knew how to navigate the complex web of regulations. One fascinating and often overlooked detail is the board's role as a financial intermediary. The women working in the house were not supposed to handle the money from the transaction directly. The client paid the board, and the board would then, in theory, pay the woman her share. This created a system ripe for exploitation. A board could easily skim off more than her fair share, charge the women for room and board at exorbitant rates, and essentially keep them in a state of perpetual debt, a system known as debt bondage. The official regulations from the bishop tried to prevent this, forbidding bordess from forcing women to work or from taking more than a fair cut, but it's a rule that would have been incredibly difficult to enforce behind closed doors. The debate among scholars is whether the board was primarily a protector or an exploiter. Was she a proto-feminist figure, a woman who carved out a position of power and autonomy in a patriarchal world, who provided a structured and relatively safe environment for her workers? Or was she just another layer of that patriarchy, a female warden in a prison designed by men, who profited from the exploitation of other, younger women? The answer is likely both. She was a business owner in a brutal business. Her survival depended on her ability to be shrewd, tough, and sometimes ruthless. You watch as she moves through the common room, her presence restoring order with just a glance. She stops to share a quiet word with one of the women, a brief, almost maternal-looking gesture, before turning to welcome a new customer with a practiced, professional smile. She is a paradox, a pillar of a sinful community, a guardian of the bishop's rules, a businesswoman, a protector, and a potential exploiter all rolled into one. She is the linchpin that holds this entire strange, sanctioned world together. And as you observe her, your gaze shifts to the other women in the room, the ones who are the actual reason for this whole enterprise, the Winchester Geese themselves. Your gaze drifts away from the formidable figure of the board to the other women in the room. They are the heart of the matter, the geese under the bishop's unlikely protection. There are perhaps half a dozen of them in the common room, some sitting by the fire, some talking quietly amongst themselves, others observing the new arrivals with a practiced, neutral gaze. If you were expecting to see women dressed in scandalous or provocative attire, you'd be disappointed. In fact, the opposite is true. One of the most surprising aspects of this regulated system is that the women were subject to a strict dress code, not just outside the stews, but inside as well. The goal of the authorities wasn't to make them alluringly different, but to prevent them from being mistaken for honest women. Their clothing was meant to be a uniform of their trade, a marker of their trade, a marker of their status. The regulations, the so-called ordinances touching the government of the stews, were incredibly specific on this point. They were forbidden from wearing fancy materials like silk or fur trimmings. Their aprons had to be made of a specific, plain material, often wool or linen, and could not be decorated. The idea was to prevent them from using fine clothes to deceive men, or to put on airs above their station. It was a visual reminder of their place in the social hierarchy, accessible, but not respectable. You observe one of the women more closely. She's young, perhaps not even 20. Her dress is simple, a plain brown woolen kirtler, functional and unadorned. Her hair is covered by a simple cap or coif. There's nothing about her attire that screams sinner in the way you might have imagined. She looks to your modern eyes like any other working-class woman of the period. A baker's wife, a weaver, a fishmonger. And that is perhaps the most poignant detail of all. They were ordinary women in an extraordinary and extraordinarily difficult situation. So who were they, and how did they end up here? The romantic notion of the tart with a heart who chose this life for its freedom and excitement is largely a fantasy. The reality was much grimmer. Most women were driven into prostitution by poverty, a crop failure back in their home village, the death of a husband or father, the lack of a dowry to secure a marriage. Any of these economic calamities could leave a woman with no other means of survival. London, like all big cities, was a magnet for the desperate, and the stews offered a roof over their heads and the promise of food in their bellies. It wasn't a choice, it was the last option on a very short list. There's a curious and rather sad piece of trivia related to their recruitment. The Brothels were forbidden by the regulations from actively soliciting or luring women into the trade. They couldn't go out and recruit. A woman had to come to the stews of her own free will. This, again, was a legal nicety designed to give the whole enterprise an air of legitimacy. But the reality was that a woman arriving in London, destitute and alone, would quickly be directed to Southwark by helpful strangers. The system didn't need to recruit, desperation did the work for it. Another crucial rule you learn about is that the women were not, under any circumstances, to be held against their will. The regulations explicitly state that no she-woman be compelled to remain against her will. A woman could, in theory, leave whenever she wanted. This is a topic of significant debate among historians. On paper, it looks like a progressive right. In practice, how real was this freedom? Many women were likely trapped by debt to the board who charged them for their food, clothing, and lodging. Leaving would mean walking out with nothing into a world that would shun them for their past. Furthermore, where would they go? Their reputation would follow them. The freedom to leave may have been, for many, a cruel illusion. You watch as one of the apprentices from earlier approaches the young woman in the brown kirtler. He speaks to her, and she nods, her face impassive. There is no flirtation, no playful banter. It's a quiet, sombre negotiation. She stands, and they walk together towards a narrow staircase leading to the upper floors. The whole interaction is stripped of romance or illusion. You see the profound control exerted over every aspect of their lives. Their dress, their finances, their very movements were circumscribed by the bishop's ordinances. They were not allowed to wander freely through the city of London on the other side of the bridge. They were largely confined to the liberty of the clink. They were, in a very real sense, prisoners of a system that claimed to protect them. The protection it offered was from the random violence of the street. But the price was submission to a rigid, exploitative, and deeply hypocritical order. Looking at these women, you don't see sirens or sinners. You see survivors navigating an impossible system with a quiet, weary resilience. You see the human cost of the city's necessary evil. And you're about to witness the core of that system, the transaction itself. The common room has thinned out a bit. The initial rush of apprentices has moved upstairs and a quieter, more somber mood has settled in. A man who looks like a merchant, older and better dressed than the others, is nursing a cup of ale by the fire. You've been a fly on the wall long enough. To truly understand this place, you have to see the central mechanism in motion. Not by participating, but by observing the cold, hard logic of the transaction up close. A new customer enters, a soldier by the look of his worn leather jerkin and the confident way he carries himself. He leaves a small dagger with the board at the door, who tucks it away under her counter. He scans the room, and his eyes land on a woman sitting alone, mending a tear in a piece of cloth. She looks up, her expression unreadable. He walks over, not to her, but to the board. This is a crucial step. According to the regulations, the deal is not to be struck with the woman herself, but with the manager of the house. This was another rule designed to maintain order and prevent disputes. The soldier and the board speak in low tones. You can't hear the exact words, but you can guess the subject. It's a negotiation. And it's all about money. One of the most fascinating things about the regulated stews is that the prices were, to some extent, standardized. A woman was not allowed to charge more than a certain amount for her services. A key historical document, a proclamation from 1433, sets the maximum price for a whole night at 14 pence. To put that in perspective, a skilled labourer in London at the time might earn about 6 pence for a full day's work. So this was not a small amount of money. It was a significant expenditure for anyone but the wealthy. Of course, there would have been other, cheaper options available. You wouldn't necessarily have to pay for the whole night. The phrase a turn, or as the French called it, a coup, implied a much shorter, and therefore cheaper, encounter. The price for this was likely just a few pence. This pricing structure reveals a lot about the clientele. It catered to different levels of the market, from the apprentice who had saved up a couple of pennies for a quick visit, to the prosperous merchant or knight who could afford the full 14 pence luxury experience. You watch the soldier and the board. He hands over a few coins. The board counts them, her face stern, then nods. Only then does she glance over at the woman who had been mending the cloth. The woman puts down her sewing, stands up, and walks towards the staircase without a word. The soldier follows her. The entire transaction took less than a minute. It was as impersonal as buying a loaf of bread. This brings up a rather odd and specific little detail from the regulations, the no-love clause. The ordinances explicitly forbade a woman in the stews from falling in love with a client, or a client from falling in love with her. It sounds like a bizarrely unenforceable rule, like trying to legislate emotion. But the purpose behind it was, again, deeply pragmatic. Love led to jealousy, possessiveness, and fights. It could lead to men spending all their money on one woman, or a woman refusing to see other clients. It undermined the fundamental principle of the stews that this was commerce, not romance. A woman who fell in love was a broken cog in the machine. A man who fell in love was a disruptive influence. Whether this rule ever actually stopped anyone from developing feelings is doubtful, but its existence on paper shows how desperately the authorities wanted to strip the humanity out of the equation and reduce it to a simple, repeatable, taxable act. Historians still puzzle over the enforcement of these financial rules. How did they prevent price gouging? How did they ensure the board gave the woman her fair share? The records of the Bishop's Court for the Liberty show cases being brought for all sorts of infractions: fighting, theft, unpaid debts, but the internal financial arrangements of the houses are much harder to see. It's likely that exploitation was rampant, and the women had little recourse. Complaining about your board to the bishop's steward was a risky move that could see you thrown out on the street. It was a system that, while offering a veneer of official protection, was heavily weighted in favor of the property owner and the business manager. The whole process feels incredibly cold. The standardized pricing, the transaction with the board, the explicit prohibition on emotion, it's all designed to make the experience as efficient and conflict-free as possible. The sin wasn't the act, the sin was making it messy. You look at the money in the board's hand, the same coins that might tomorrow be used to buy bread from a baker, who will use them to pay his rent to his landlord, who will use them to pay his tithe to the church. You see the sin money being washed, cleansed by its journey through the marketplace, re-entering the normal flow of the city's economy without a trace of its sordid origin. It's the economic manifestation of the necessary evil philosophy. The transaction is complete. The system has worked. But as you watch the woman and the soldier disappear up the stairs, you can't help but think about the other side of the rulebook, the regulations that applied not to the customers, but exclusively to the women themselves. You remain in the common room, the fire crackling and spitting, the air thick with the smell of stale ale and damp wool. The transaction you witnessed was governed by rules aimed at the customer, designed to keep them in line. But now, you start to uncover the other side of this legalistic coin, the web of regulations that ensnared the women. These rules weren't about maintaining order for a fleeting transaction. They were about controlling every aspect of the women's lives, branding them, and containing them. They were a set of invisible and sometimes very visible chains. The first and most striking rule you learn about is the one concerning movement. A woman working in the stews was not a free citizen of London. She was largely confined to the liberty of the clink. She could not freely cross London Bridge to go shopping in the Cheapside Market or pray in St. Paul's Cathedral. She was forbidden from wandering the streets of the city proper, from visiting taverns or markets on the respectable side of the river. If she was found there, she could be arrested, brought before the city's courts, and punished often by being publicly shamed in the stocks or pillory. The rationale was simple: to prevent the sin of the stews from contaminating the rest of the city and to stop the women from potentially luring honest men or being mistaken for virtuous women. They were geographically quarantined. Then there was the dress code we touched on earlier, but it deserves a deeper look. It wasn't just about forbidding luxury, it was about imposing a uniform of shame. In many parts of medieval Europe, not just London, prostitutes were required by law to wear a specific article of clothing, or a certain color that would immediately identify them. This is a fascinating and grim little corner of history. In some cities, it was a striped hood or a yellow sash. The exact requirement for London is a matter of some debate among historians, but the principle was the same across Europe. The idea was to make them instantly recognizable, to prevent any ambiguity. An honest woman who dressed too flamboyantly might be mistaken for a prostitute, a terrible insult. A prostitute who dressed too plainly might pass for an honest woman, a dangerous deception in the eyes of the authorities. This forced marking was a form of social control, a visual manifestation of their status as outsiders. Another set of rules governed their working lives with brutal specificity. They were not allowed to work on major religious holidays. The stews were ordered to be shut down completely during Lent, the holy season leading up to Easter. The doors were barred, and the women were, in theory, supposed to spend this time in penitence. What this meant in practice was that for several weeks, their only source of income was completely cut off. The bishop might cease collecting rent for that period, but the women and the bawdess still needed to eat. This likely drove many to work illegally and covertly in other parts of the city, at great personal risk. This sacred holiday rule, meant to show piety, paradoxically created more desperation and more danger. Furthermore, a woman with a perilous infirmity of burning, the contemporary term for venereal disease, was supposed to be put out of the house. The board was responsible for evicting any woman who showed signs of sickness, and there was a hefty fine for failing to do so. This sounds like a public health measure, and it was, but it was a terrifyingly cruel one. A sick woman, already suffering, would be cast out with no income and no means of care. She would be utterly destitute, likely dying alone in some forgotten alley. The system that profited from her health would abandon her at the first sign of illness. The rules extended even to their personal lives. A woman was forbidden from having a pimp or ruffian to protect her or solicit for her. All her dealings had to be through the officially sanctioned board. This was to prevent the rise of violent gangs controlling the trade, but it also isolated the women, ensuring their sole reliance was on the official exploitative structure. You begin to see how these regulations, while masquerading as order and protection, created a perfect trap. The women were geographically contained, visually marked, economically controlled, and socially isolated. They were protected from random violence only to be subjected to systematic, bureaucratic control. The law was a double-edged sword. It offered a slim shield against a chaotic world, but its other edge was constantly pressing against their throat. Historians debate whether this system was, on balance, better for women than the alternative of illegal, unregulated prostitution. In the regulated stews, they had at least some legal recourse against violence. A board had an incentive to keep them healthy, but the price was the complete loss of autonomy. It's a grim calculation. The system wasn't designed for their benefit, it was designed for the benefit of the city's male citizens on the bishop's treasury. The women were just the raw material that made it all work. And as you mull over this harsh reality, you remember that cynical, strange nickname you heard earlier, the one that so perfectly captured their status as property. You're still lingering in the common room of the Cross Keys, the sounds of the house are low hum around you. The fire has died down to glowing embers, and the board is now sitting at her table, making notes in a ledger with a piece of charcoal. The nickname you heard earlier echoes in your mind: Winchester Geese. It's such a peculiar, almost whimsical term for such a grim reality. You decide to try and understand its origins. You spot the man from earlier, the one who was whittling on the doorstep. H.E.S. come inside for a cheap cup of ale and is sitting by himself in a corner. You wander over, make a bit of small talk about the damp weather, and then as casually as you can you ask him about the name. Why Geese? You ask. He takes a slow sip of his ale and gives you a wry smile. Well, for one, they're always sea ackland, ain't they? He says with a shrug. But that ain't the real reason. He leans in a little, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It's 'cause they belong to the bishop. Like his flock, but not his sheep, see? The explanation is both simple and profound. Geese, on a medieval manor, were livestock. They were property. They were raised for their meat, their eggs, and their feathers. They were a source of income, an asset listed in the manorial accounts. To call these women Winchester Geese was to explicitly and cynically label them as the Bishop of Winchester's livestock. It was a joke, but a joke with a sharp, bitter edge that everyone understood. It perfectly encapsulated their legal and social standing. They were owned, not in the sense of chattel slavery, but in the sense that their livelihoods, their homes, and their very bodies were tied to the land and the authority of their powerful, pious landlord. This nickname wasn't just idle street slang, it was a reflection of a deep-seated reality. There's a fascinating, if slightly disgusting, piece of historical trivia that ties this all together. The term goosebumps as we know it has a straightforward origin. But in the 16th century, the Winchester goose also became a slang term for a specific and unpleasant ailment, the swelling and sores associated with venereal disease. It was a cruel joke, linking the bishop's geese directly with the primary occupational hazard they faced. The disease was, in a way, seen as their trademark, a mark of their trade almost as much as the striped hood or yellow sash might have been in other places. You let the weight of that sink in. The very name for their suffering was tied up in a joke about the bishop. This reveals the incredible level of cognitive dissonance the society was comfortable with. They could hold in their minds, simultaneously, the idea of the bishop as a holy man of God and the bishop as the proprietor of a business that spread the perilous infirmity of burning. Historians still explore the nuances of this ownership. It wasn't direct. The bishop didn't personally manage the stews. He delegated that to his stewards and bailiffs. He likely never set foot in the liberty of the clink himself. The system was designed with layers of separation, allowing him to maintain plausible deniability and a clear conscience. Yet, the ownership was undeniable. He profited from the rents. His court administered the justice. His regulations, the famous ordinances, were the law of the land. The women were his responsibility, his asset, and his problem. The whittlard drains his cup. Thing is, he adds, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand, a goose is a noisy bird, hard to ignore, and they can bite back if you corner 'em. It's a striking image. It suggests that while they were considered property, they were not entirely passive. They had voices, they could cause trouble. The reams of regulations were not just about controlling them, they were also a testament to the fact that they needed to be controlled, that they were human beings who would push back against the system in small and large ways. This nickname, Winchester Geese, is a perfect little artifact of history. It contains multitudes, the hypocrisy of the elite, the commodification of women, the grim humor of the common folk, and the faint, almost imperceptible hint of the women's own agency. It's a term that is simultaneously demeaning, descriptive, and, in its own strange way, a marker of a unique identity. They weren't just prostitutes, they were the Winchester Geese, they belonged to a specific geese. They belonged to a specific geese, they belonged, infamous and officially sanctioned community. You thank the whittler for his insight. You feel like you have a handle on how this strange corner of London works. But London wasn't the only city in Europe with such a system. The necessary evil philosophy was widespread. You realize that to truly understand the phenomenon, you need a point of comparison. What if you could see how the Germans handled it? What would a state-run house of sin look like with German efficiency behind it? In a blink, the smoky, damp common room of the Cross Keys dissolves around you, the sounds of Middle English fade, replaced by the guttural tones of German, and the soft Thames mud is replaced by sturdy Bavarian cobblestone. The world reforms around you. The air feels different, drier, crisper. The architecture has changed. The leaning timber-framed houses of London have been replaced by tall, more severe-looking stone buildings with steep, tiled roofs. The language you hear swirling around you is sharp and Germanic. You are no longer in Southwark. You've blinked, and now you're standing in a clean, well-ordered square in the free imperial city of Augsburg, a wealthy hub of trade and banking in southern Germany. Sometime in the late 15th century, London's system, with its strange landlord-tenant relationship between a bishop and the bordess, was one model. But many cities on the continent took an even more direct approach. They cut out the middleman. Here in Augsburg, and in many other German and Italian cities, the brothel wasn't leased out by a religious figure, it was owned, operated, and managed directly by the city council. It was a municipal department, like the city watch or the tax office. You ask a passerby for directions to the Frauenhaus, the women's house. The term is direct, descriptive, and devoid of the strange, historical euphemism of the stews. The citizen doesn't give you a knowing crook smile. He points matter-of-factly toward a large, imposing building on a specific street, just as if you'd asked for the town hall. Because, in a way, that's what it was, an extension of the town hall's authority. As you approach the building, you're struck by its appearance. It's not a row of shabby, individual houses in a muddy lane. It's a single large, unsurprisingly grand structure. It's clean, well-maintained, and looks no different from the Guildhall or the home of a wealthy merchant. This was a point of civic pride. If the city was going to do it properly, the Frauenhaus was a reflection of the city's ability to maintain order. Chaotic brothel would be a sign of a poorly managed city. A clean, efficient, orderly one was a testament to good governance. At the door, you're met not by a board in the London sense, but by a man. He is the Frauenwirt, the women's host or manager. And here's a fascinating detail. He was a sworn municipal officer. He was hired by the city council, paid a salary, and had to swear a public oath to uphold the statutes of the house and the laws of the city. He was a civil servant whose portfolio happened to be prostitution. His job was to maintain discipline, manage the finances, and ensure the health and safety of both the women and the clients. Inside, the atmosphere is starkly different from the London's too. It's less like a tavern and more like a barracks or a hospital ward. It's clean, organized, and dearly quiet. The women you see are dressed in plain, uniform-like clothing, also dictated by the city statutes. The rules here were, if anything, even more stringent than in London. The city council, being good and pious Germans, produced reams of regulations ordering and covering every conceivable detail. A little-known fact about these German municipal brothels is the level of care and provision they offered, which stood in stark contrast to the more hands-off English model. The Frauenhaus often had its own resident cook, who was also a city employee to provide regular meals for the women. Some even had a dedicated bath keeper and a laundress. Most astonishingly, many larger cities employed a doctor or a surgeon, paid by the council, to conduct regular health inspections of the women. If a woman was found to be sick, she wasn't just cast out into the street like in London. The city, having invested in her as a municipal asset, would often pay for her to be treated in the city hospital. It's a jarring combination of compassion and cold, civic calculus. They weren't treating her because she was a human being deserving of care, they were fixing a piece of city equipment that had broken down. The financing was also more direct. The money paid by a client went directly to the Frauenwirt. He would log it in his account book, which was regularly audited by the city treasurer. A portion of the earnings was used to pay for the upkeep of the house, the salaries of the staff, and the women's food and board. The remainder was divided, with a share going into the city's coffers and a share being paid out to the woman as her wage. On paper, it was a much cleaner, more transparent system than the murky debt bondage of the London's twos. However, historians debate how much real freedom this cleaner system offered. The women were still, in essence, municipal employees in a state-run monopoly. They couldn't just quit and set up shop for themselves. That would be illegal. They lived under constant direct surveillance by a city official. Their lives were regimented from the moment they woke to the moment they woke to the moment they slept. The city council dictated their diet, their clothing, their hours of work, and even when they were allowed to leave the building. This German model represents the necessary evil philosophy taken to its logical conclusion. The sin was fully nationalized. It was tamed, sanitized until it resembled any other public service. The city of Augsburg was not ashamed of its frown house, it was proud of how well it was run. It was a symbol of their ability to manage even the most unsavory aspects of human society with efficiency and order. But in this sterile, well-managed environment, the human element feels even more suppressed than in the chaotic, grimy world of the Winchester Geese. The system is more humane in its provisions, but perhaps more dehumanizing in its total control. You stand in the quiet, orderly hall of the Augsburg Frown House and feel a different kind of chill. This isn't the hypocrisy of a bishop profiting from sin, this is the chilling efficiency of the state mastering it. And it forces you to look back at that great, contradictory institution that loomed over both systems, the church itself. You snap back from the sterile efficiency of Augsburg to the murky, compromised reality of London. The common room of the Cross Keys feels almost comforting in its chaotic humanity compared to the municipal dormitory you just witnessed. The core contradiction, however, remains the same in both places. And it's the elephant in the room of medieval society, the church's incredibly awkward, deeply conflicted stance on this whole business. On the one hand, the official doctrine was absolute and unwavering. Fornication, any sexual act outside of marriage, was a mortal sin. It was a stain on the soul that, if unconfessed and unabsolved, would lead to eternal damnation. Priests preached it, theologians wrote lengthy treatises on it, and art depicted it in terrifying detail on the walls of churches, with lustful souls being prodded by demons in the fires of hell. From a purely theological standpoint, the women of the stews and their clients were all on a highway to hell, and the Brothels and the Bishop of Winchester were effectively selling the tickets. So how did they square this circle? How did an institution that believed so fervently in the sinfulness of the act simultaneously become its landlord and regulator? This is where you witness the magnificent, almost athletic mental gymnastics of medieval thought. It was a grand balancing act between theology and reality. First, there was the necessary evil argument we've already explored, famously articulated by Augustine and Aquinas. This was the intellectual bedrock. By containing the sin, you prevented a greater, more chaotic sinfulness from spreading. It was a form of spiritual triage. You sacrifice a few souls in a designated zone to save the moral fabric of the entire city. It was a grim, pragmatic choice, but one that was endorsed by the greatest minds of the church. This allowed a bishop to see his role not as a promoter of sin, but as a reluctant manager of it for the greater good. Second, there was a crucial distinction made between the sin itself and the structures that housed it. This is a fine point, but a vital one for understanding the medieval mindset. The Bishop of Winchester did not, in theory, profit from the act of fornication. He profited from the leasing of property. He was a landlord. What his tenants did within the privacy of that property was, in a legal and financial sense, their business. This created a layer of separation. The money that landed in his coffers was rent, not a coffers was rent, not a cost benefit financially, while maintaining a degree of spiritual distance. It's a loophole to be sure, but one that was foundational to the whole system. Third, the church never stopped preaching against the sin. This is key. The existence of the regulated stews did not mean the church condoned the activity. Far from it. A man who visited the stews was still expected to go to confession, repent his sin, and perform penance. The women themselves were seen as perennial sinners, constantly in need of redemption. In fact, there were specific religious institutions, like the Magdalene hospitals or convents, established specifically to rescue and reform prostitutes who wished to leave the life. A fascinating and little-known fact is that the church offered a kind of out. A prostitute who publicly repented and chose a life of piety was often celebrated as a model of God's transformative grace, a living symbol of Mary Magdalene. This provided a theological escape hatch. The system existed, but so did the path to redemption from it. So you have this bizarre triangulation of belief and practice. The church officially condemns the act, pragmatically allows the institution, and simultaneously offers a path to salvation for those who participate in it. It's a system that covers all the bases. But historians, of course, have a more cynical take, and they continue to debate the church's true motivations. Was this complex theological framework just an elaborate justification for what was, at its heart, a very lucrative business? The church was a massive economic entity. It owned vast tracts of land, and that land needed to generate income. The manor of Southwark was a prime piece of real estate, and the stews made it profitable. The necessary evil argument, while theologically sound, was also incredibly convenient for a landlord. You can picture a meeting of the bishop's financial advisors. They would look at the ledgers at the income from the wool farms, the fish ponds, and the rents from the Southwark stews. It was all just numbers on a page. The moral dimension could be safely left to the theologians, who had already provided a perfectly workable justification. The result is an institution that appears deeply hypocritical to modern eyes. It's like a hospital that owns a fast food chain, or a fire department that sells matches. This conflict was not lost on people at the time. The rise of reformers like John Wycliffe in the 14th century saw fierce attacks on the wealth and perceived hypocrisy of the church, and the stews, owned by a bishop, were an easy and obvious target. They were a physical embodiment of the argument that the church had become too worldly, too entangled in the grubby business of making money, and had lost its spiritual authority. You look around the common room. The whole scene is a monument to this contradiction. A business dedicated to mortal sin, operating legally on land owned by a prince of the church, or under a framework of theological justification that is both intellectually ingenious and morally breathtaking. And it makes you wonder, if the sin is this profitable, where does all that money actually go? The question hangs in the smoky air of the common room. Where does the money go? You've seen the transaction, the coins passing from the soldier to the board. You know a portion of that will go to the woman, and a hefty chunk will go to the board for her troubles and her overhead. But the most significant, most consistent flow of cash is the rent. The steady stream of silver pennies and groats, flowing from the 12s to houses into the coffers of Bishop of Winchester, and from a place like Augsburg's Frauenhaus the profits flowed directly into the city treasury. This wasn't pocket change, it was a serious, reliable source of revenue. So, what did they do with this syntax? You might imagine it being kept separate, used only for unclean purposes. But that's not how medieval finance worked. Money was money. Once it entered the treasury, it lost its moral taint and became just another asset on the ledger. This unclean money mingled with income from market tolls, court fines, and agricultural rents, and was used to fund all the necessities of civic and ecclesiastical life. Let's follow the journey of a few of those coins you saw the soldier hand over. The board takes her cut, and at the end of the week, the bishop's steward comes knocking. He collects the rent for the cross keys. That money is taken back across the river and deposited in the bishop's treasury. From there, it could go anywhere. A portion might be used to pay for the expensive beeswax candles that burn on the high altar of Winchester Cathedral. Another portion might go towards the wages of the stonemasons who are adding a new soaring archway to the cathedral's nave. The very stones of the church, the house of God, might have been paid for, in part, by the proceeds of the stews. It's a startling thought. The prayers of the faithful ascend to heaven in a building financed by the city's most organized sin. This wasn't a secret. The bishop's finances were, to a degree, public knowledge among the ruling classes. It was just an accepted part of the world's messy reality. The money, once laundered through the bishop's accounts, became sanctified by its new purpose. Now let's think about the municipal model in Augsburg. The profits from the Frauenhaus, after paying for its own upkeep and salaries, went straight into the city's general fund. From there, that money had a fascinating and varied life. It might be used to pay the salaries of the city watchmen who patrolled the walls at night, keeping the citizens safe. It could be used to repair a section of the city wall, the very defense that protected Augsburg from its enemies. It could go towards paving a new street, funding the construction of a new public fountain. or even paying the salary of the town executioner. Here's a wonderfully ironic piece of trivia for you. In some cities, the profits from the municipal brothel were specifically earmarked to pay for the city's wars. The money earned from the institutionalized act of love, so to speak, was used to buy pikes, crossbows. The Frown House was a tool for maintaining internal order. The army was a tool for maintaining external order. It was all part of the same pragmatic business of running a city. This use of the money is, for historians, a source of endless fascination. It shows how deeply integrated these institutions were into the fabric of society. They weren't on the fringe, they were part of the mainstream economy. The debate isn't about if this happened, but about how the people at the time rationalized it. Did they see the irony? Or was their worldview so different from ours that the concept of tainted money didn't apply in the same way? The evidence suggests that for most, practicality trumped piety. A city needed strong walls and a well-paid guard. If the brothel helped pay for it, so be it. You look around the room again. You see the worn wooden tables, the cheap earthenware cups. It all seems so small-scale, so sordid. But when you extrapolate, when you think about the cumulative financial power of this place, and its dozen or so counterparts, all paying rent, week after week, year after year, you realize you're sitting inside a significant economic engine. The necessary evil was also a necessary line item in the budget. It built cathedrals and it forged cannons. It paid for prayers and it paid for pikes. The hypocrisy is baked into the very infrastructure of the world around you. And as you contemplate this, you remember the original name for this district, the stews, a name that hinted at bathing. This connection between cleanliness and sinfulness, you realize, is another layer of irony worth exploring. You decide to leave the smoky confines of the Cross Keys and walk back out into the damp, grey air of the Southwark Lane. The name the stews keeps turning over in your mind. You now know it came from the old Bathurses, the street up-rum as they were sometimes called in Latin records, which once dominated this area. This connection between bathing and brothels wasn't unique to London. It was a common theme across Europe, and it opens up a deeply ironic chapter in the history of public health and morality. In the earlier Middle Ages, particularly the 12th and 13th centuries, communal bathing was a popular and relatively respectable activity. People, often men and women together, would gather in large, heated bathhouses to get clean, to socialize, and even to have meals served to them on floating trays. It was a place of leisure. The church, while always a bit suspicious of anything that involved large numbers of naked people having fun, generally tolerated it. Bathing was, after all, a good thing, but, as we've established, where there are warm, private-ish spaces, other business opportunities tend to arise. The bathhouses gradually earned a reputation. The bathing became a cover for prostitution. The very words to began its slow slide in meaning, from a place you go to get clean to a place you go to get sinful. By the 14th century, the authorities were starting to crack down, not on the prostitution itself, but on the mixing of bathing and prostitution. They tried to regulate the two things into separate spheres. In London, this culminated in the stew houses of Southwark, which, as we noted, may not have even offered baths anymore. They retained the name, but the original function was gone, leaving only the secondary one. This historical shift leads to a profound and tragic irony concerning health and hygiene. As the bathhouses became increasingly associated with sexual immorality, the church began to condemn them more forcefully. Moralists preached that these public baths were dens of iniquity that led to lust and lewdness. They also argued with a certain medical logic that opening the pores of the body with hot water could allow sickness and bad air, the miasma, to enter the body. The result? Over the course of the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, public bathing fell out of fashion and largely disappeared from Christian Europe. Personal hygiene declined precipitously. People, even the wealthy, began to bathe much less frequently, preferring to clean themselves with linen cloths and to mask body odor with perfume. This fear of bathing, which was partly rooted in the moral panic surrounding the Bathurst brothels, had very real public health consequences. And here's the kicker, the part that is so full of historical paradox, it almost hurts. While the general population was being scared away from water, the authorities in the stews were obsessed with a very specific kind of cleanliness. Remember the rule about evicting any woman with the perilous infirmity of burning. That was a health regulation, however cruel. The city council in Augsburg hired a doctor to do inspections. They were practicing a rudimentary form of public health management, not for the good of the general populace, but for the specific purpose of keeping their commercialized sin clean and safe for the customers. So you have a society that is, on the one hand, abandoning general public hygiene partly due to the moral stain of places like the stews, while on the other hand, a place like the stews is one of the few environments subject to any kind of regular, official health inspection. It's a completely backward situation. Historians are still debating the full impact of the decline of bathing culture. It certainly wasn't the only factor in the spread of disease, but it didn't help. The great irony is that the effort to curb the sin associated with bathhouses may have inadvertently contributed to a less healthy society overall. A lesser-known fact is that this fear of water wasn't universal. The Islamic world, for instance, maintained a vibrant and essential tradition of public hammams, seeing bathing as a crucial part of spiritual and physical purity, a perspective that was largely lost in Christian Europe during this period. You look at the mud in the lane, the grime on the walls, and you think about this strange, twisted relationship with water and cleanliness. The very name of this district is a ghost of a cleaner, more communal past. The reality of it is a business that, in a grimly practical way, is more concerned with the specific hygiene of sin than the society outside is with the general hygiene of its citizens. The efforts to keep the soul pure lead to the body being less clean. The effort to keep the business of sin pure for its customers led to a cruel, but focused form of medical surveillance. It's a paradox that reveals how deeply intertwined the concepts of moral, spiritual, and how easily they could be twisted into unnatural shapes. And as you're pondering this, you notice something else, another form of marking, not of disease, but of shame, that the women have to bear once they step outside these walls. Your thoughts on hygiene and history are interrupted by a small commotion at the end of the lane. One of the women from the Cross Keys is leaving the Liberty, perhaps to run an errand in a permitted part of Southwark, or maybe she's visiting one of the few places she was allowed to go. As she steps out from the perpetual twilight of the alley into the broader, brighter light of the main street, you notice it, a detail of her clothing you hadn't seen inside. It's striped with two different colors of cloth, a stark eye-catching pattern. It's not fashionable. It's not pretty. It's a label. This was the reality of the shameful marking we touched upon earlier, made visible and unavoidable. While the specific article of clothing varied from city to city and decade to decade, the principle was universal across much of Europe. Prostitutes, when in public, were legally required to wear a designated item that advertised their profession to the world, leaving no room for doubt or deception. In London for a time, the rule was a hood of striped cloth red and parti-coloured. In other places, like Bristol, it was a striped garment. In parts of France, it was a red cord sewn onto the shoulder. In Venice, it was a yellow scarf. In Florence, they had to wear gloves and a bell on their head. Imagine that, the constant, tiny jingle announcing your presence, your status, your shame. The purpose was to prevent them from being mistaken for honorable women. An insult to a virtuous woman's reputation was a serious matter, and visual clarity was paramount. Second, it was a form of public penance, a constant, wearable reminder of their sinful state. They were marked women, visibly set apart from the rest of society. You watch the woman in the striped hood walk down the street. People give her a wide berth. Some stare openly, others pointedly look away. A group of children point and whisper. The hood acts as a kind of force field, isolating her in a bubble of public recognition and judgment. It's a powerful to love social control. It stripped her of her anonymity. She could never just be a person walking down the street. She was always, first and foremost, a prostitute from the stews. This practice raises a fascinating question for historians. Was this marking purely about shame? Or did it have another, more complex function? Some scholars argue that while it was undoubtedly shaming, it also served as a strange form of protection. In a world with no formal police force as we know it, visual codes were vital. The striped hood was a clear signal to the men of the city: this woman works in the bishop's stews. She is under the protection of the liberties regulations. You cannot harass her with impunity. It was a no-touch sign in a way. Attacking a woman so clearly marked as one of the geese was an offense not just against her, but against the bishop's authority and property. It's a classic double-edged sword. The very symbol that shamed her also, in theory, shielded her. It's a difficult concept for us to grasp, this blending of shame and safety. But in the rigid, hierarchical world of the Middle Ages, having a clearly defined place, even a low one, was sometimes safer than having no place at all. There's a small, poignant detail about these laws that is often overlooked. In some cities, the regulations also stipulated what honest women were not allowed to wear. They were forbidden from wearing the striped hoods or yellow scarves, precisely to avoid any confusion. If a virtuous woman was caught wearing the colors of infamy, she could be punished for causing a public scandal. The law cut both ways, enforcing a strict visual apartheid between the good women and the bad women. The debate still rages in academic circles about the lived experience of these markings. Was it a constant, soul-crushing burden of shame? Or did some women, over time, come to wear it with a kind of defiant indifference, as a uniform of their trade and a symbol of their survival? We have very few first-hand accounts from the women themselves, so we are left to interpret the cold, hard text of the law and the reactions of outside observers. The records are full of fines levied on women who refused to wear their designated sign, who tried to blend in, to pass as normal for a few hours. These small acts of defiance, of wanting to be anonymous, speak volumes about how heavy the burden of the striped hood must have been. You watch until the woman disappears around a corner, the flash of her striped hood the last thing you see. The visual brand is gone, but the social brand remains. It makes you wonder about the deeper, more internal aspects of their lives. The rules and markings govern their public existence. But what about their private hopes? Was there any escape? Could a woman marked so publicly ever hope to find something as private and personal as love, or a path to a different life? The image of the woman in the striped hood lingers in your mind long after she has gone. The public marking, the social isolation, the economic bondage, it all seems to paint a picture of a life without hope, a dead-end street. And for many, perhaps most of the women in the stews, that was likely the reality. But human beings are resilient, and the desire for love, security, and a different future can bloom in the most barren soil. The question of whether a Winchester goose could find love and freedom is not just a romantic notion, it was a real, if remote, possibility governed by its own set of rules and social customs. The most straightforward path out of the stews was marriage. Surprisingly, it was not legally impossible for a prostitute to marry. If a man wished to marry a woman from the stews, he could, in theory, do so. This act was seen by the church as a profoundly virtuous one. The man was saving a fallen woman, rescuing a soul from a life of sin and setting her on the path of righteousness. He was, in essence, performing a living act of charity. Such a marriage would wash away the stain of her past in the eyes of God and the law. However, the social reality was far more complicated. What kind of man would marry a prostitute? It was highly unlikely to be a man of wealth or high status. A merchant's son or a young nobleman would be expected to marry for family alliance and property. And a wife for the past in the stews would be a social disaster. The men who did marry women from the stews were typically from a similar social strata: laborers, soldiers, small-time craftsmen, men with little to lose in terms of social standing. There was, of course, a catch, and it was a financial one. A woman working in a storehouse was often in debt to the board. She owed money for her room, her board, her clothes, her medical care. Before a man could marry her, he would have to pay off her debt. He was, in effect, redeeming her not just spiritually, but financially. He was buying out her contract. This is a fascinating and often overlooked aspect of the system, the redemption fee. It ensured the board didn't lose out on her investment. Some boarders likely inflated the debt when a potential suitor appeared, making the woman's freedom even more expensive. This leads to a little-known but poignant custom. In some parts of Europe, if a man declared his intention to marry a woman from a brothel, the city would sometimes step in to help. The town council might officially waive the woman's debts to the house, or even provide her with a small rehabilitation dowry to help her and her new husband get started. This wasn't done out of pure romantic sentiment. It was good civic policy. A marriage was a stable social unit. Every prostitute who got married was one less problem for the city to manage. It was a win for everyone. The man was seen as virtuous, the woman was saved, and the city had one less goose to regulate. But what about love in the romantic sense? We've already seen that the regulations forbade falling in love, as it was bad for business. But laws cannot govern the heart. It is almost certain that genuine attachments formed between women and their clients. The historical record is mostly silent on this, as such relationships belong to the private, unwritten world. But we can speculate. A regular client might become a protector, a confidant. A quiet affection could grow. For a woman living a life of constant risk and transaction, a man who showed her genuine kindness and respect would have been powerfully alluring. For a man, the fantasy of rescuing a beautiful, vulnerable woman is an old and potent one. The debate among historians is how often this actually happened. Was the prostitute marries a client and lives happily ever after a common occurrence, or a one-in-a-million fairy tale? The consensus leans towards the latter. For most women, the daily reality was a long series of anonymous, transactional encounters. The hope of being rescued was likely a distant dream, something to whisper about with the other women by the fire late at night. The path to freedom was narrow and fraught with obstacles. It required finding a man willing to defy social convention, a man with the means to pay off her debts, and it required navigating the complex financial and legal hurdles designed by the board and the system. It was possible. It did happen. But for every woman who walked out of the stews on the arm of a husband, there were likely 100 others who grew old within their walls, their hopes fading with each passing year. You realize that to truly understand their lives, you need to look beyond the dramatic moments of transaction and escape, and try to imagine the quiet, mundane reality of an ordinary day. The grand themes of sin, economics, and law are fascinating, but they don't tell you what it felt like to actually live this life. What was a normal day like for one of the Winchester Geese? The historical record written by men and focused on rules and finances rarely gives us this perspective. So let's use what we know to piece together a speculative, but plausible, day in the life of a woman. Let's call her Eleanor, working at the Brothels to housing. Say, 6:6. Eleanor's day doesn't start with the sun. It likely starts much later, around mid-morning. The nights are long and are the core of her working life. Sleep is a precious commodity, often interrupted. The room she wakes up in is not her own. She probably shares a small, drafty chamber in the upper floors of the house with one or two other women. The bed is a simple straw-filled mattress on the floor, or on a crude wooden frame, shared for warmth. There is no privacy. A small wooden comb, maybe a sentimental trinket from her life before London, are kept in a small wooden box at the foot of the bed. The first task of the day is to make herself presentable. She would wash her face and hands with a basin of cold water. A full bath is a rare luxury. She puts on her work clothes, the simple, unadorned kirtland apron required by the regulations. The dress is likely provided by the board, and its cost is added to Eleanor's ever-growing debt. Downstairs, the common room is being cleaned. The floor is swept. The hearth is cleared of last night's ashes, and the air is still thick with the lingering smell of spilled ale and smoke. The first meal of the day is simple and starchy, a piece of dark bread, perhaps a thin porridge or pottage, or watery vegetable stew. The food is, again, provided by the board, and it's another entry in her ledger. The afternoons are a strange limbo. The house is not yet open for business. This is a time for chores and for waiting. Eleanor might be tasked with helping the board, mending torn linen, spinning thread, or helping to prepare the evening meal. This work is unpaid, it's part of what she owes for her keep. It's during these quiet hours that the semblance of a community might form. The women would talk, sharing stories, gossip, and complaints. They would form friendships and rivalries. They would teach newcomers the rules of the house and the ways to handle difficult clients. This small, enclosed society of women would be her only real family. A fascinating little detail that sheds light on their lives comes from archaeological digs in former red light districts. In one such dig in Lübeck, Germany, archaeologists found a surprising number of small, cheap personal items, simple rings, devotional medallions, and even children's toys. This suggests that some of the women may have been mothers, their children living either with them in the houses against the rules, but likely happening or fostered out nearby. This paints a much more complex and heartbreaking picture of their daily lives. The presence of a devotional medallion hints that Faith was not absent. A woman could see herself as a sinner in her trade, but still hold on to her personal belief in God and the saints, praying for intercession or a better life. As evening approaches, the atmosphere in the house changes. The fire is built up, the board takes her position, the doors are opened. This is when Eleanor's real work begins. She must go down to the common room and make herself available. She must sit and wait to be chosen. This waiting, historians speculate, might have been one of the most psychologically taxing parts of the job. The constant scrutiny, the feeling of being on display, the uncertainty of whether she would earn anything that night. Her interactions with clients are governed by the strict rules we've discussed. The transaction is handled by the board. Her time with the client is supposed to be professional, detached. But no rule can truly erase the risk, the fear, or the sheer physical and emotional exhaustion. She might have a few clients in an evening, or none at all. On a good night, she earns enough to make a small dent in her debt. On a bad night, the debt grows. The night ends late. The last drunken customer is ushered out. The doors are barred. Eleanor and the other women would trudge back up to their shared room, bone-weary. The cycle is over, ready to begin again the next day. It's a life of monotony, punctuated by moments of potential danger. The debate among scholars is about the degree of agency a woman like Eleanor had within this structure. Could she refuse a client she feared? The regulations said yes. But defying the board was risky. It was nearly impossible with the debt system. Her life was a constant, exhausting negotiation, not for power, but for survival. And then, sometimes, the whole system would grind to a halt, not by her choice, but by the command of the church calendar. Eleanor's monotonous cycle of long nights and weary days is not endless. It is punctuated by periods of forced inactivity, dictated not by her own needs or the demands of the market, but by the sacred rhythm of the Christian calendar. And the most significant of these holy interruptions is Lent. As the city enters the 40-day period of fasting and penitence leading up to Easter, a strange stillness descends upon the liberty of the clink. By order of the bishop, the very man who profits from this place, the stewhouses are officially closed. A proclamation is read out, signs might be posted, and the doors of the bell, the cross keys, and all the others are barred. For the duration of this holy season, the business of sin must cease. The Winchester Geese are, in effect, furloughed for God. This Lenten closure was a serious and strictly enforced rule. It was a public performance of piety on a grand scale. The city, and particularly the church, needed to demonstrate that despite the pragmatic tolerance of the stews, faith and holiness still held ultimate authority. Closing the brothels was a powerful symbolic act, a way of washing the city's hands of its necessary evil, at least for a little while. The bishop, by shutting down his own lucrative enterprise for Lent, was performing his role as a spiritual leader, placing the salvation of his flock above his financial income. But what did this mean for Eleanor? On the surface, it might seem like a welcome break. 40 days without the exhausting, often dangerous work of the nights. But the reality was far from a vacation. It was a period of intense economic hardship and uncertainty. The regulations stipulated that a woman could not be forced to leave the stew house during the closure, and the board was not supposed to charge her for room and board during this time. This was a measure designed to prevent the boardess from simply casting the women out onto the streets. However, with no income, life became incredibly difficult. The food provided by the board, if any, would be meagre. There was no money for any small personal comforts. The 40 days would be a time of hunger and boredom. The house, usually humming with a grim energy, would become a quiet, tense prison filled with women with nothing to do but wait. A little known but fascinating detail is what some women were encouraged to do during this time. They were supposed to focus on penitence. Some may have attended church services more regularly in parishes that would allow them. Others might have been sent to do penance at specific shrines or chapels. The Magdalen hospitals, the institutions for reformed prostitutes, would see an uptick in interest during Lent, though many women likely viewed them with suspicion, as entering one often meant a life of hard labor and strict religious discipline, from which there was no easy exit. Of course, human nature and economic necessity don't simply switch off for 40 days. The Lenten ban created a thriving black market. Historians who study court records from this period see a spike in arrests of freelance prostitutes operating illegally in other parts of the city during Lent. It's highly probable that many women from the official stews, including perhaps our Eleanor, would take a huge risk. Under the cover of darkness, she might slip out of Southwark, her striped hood hidden, and try to earn a few pennies in the back alleys of London proper. This was incredibly dangerous. If caught, she would face not only the wrath of the city authorities but also the board for breaking the rules and potentially bringing scandal upon the house. She would have no protection, no regulated space, and would be at the mercy of any client she found. The very rule designed to promote holiness created a more desperate and dangerous form of sin. The debate among scholars is about the true purpose of the Lenten closure. Was it genuinely about piety? Or was it also a tool of social control? Some argue that this annual pause served to reinforce the power of the bishop and the board over the women. It reminded them that their right to work was a privilege, not a right, and that it could be taken away at any time. It kept them dependent and off balance. When Easter finally arrived, with its joyous celebrations of resurrection, the doors of the stews would be unbarred. Business would resume. The women, hungrier and more in debt than ever, would return to the common room. The city, having performed its 40 days of public piety, could go back to pragmatic piece of social engineering, allowing society to have its cake and eat it too. It acknowledged God's law while accommodating man's weakness. It was just another part of a life lived at the mercy of powerful forces she could not control: the lust of men, the greed of the board, and the calendar of the church. But what happened when the customers, the men who came seeking pleasure, were the ones to break the rules? The Lenten quiet has passed, and business in the Cross Keys is back to its usual grimy rhythm. The rules of the house, as we've established, are paramount. But rules are made to be broken, especially when cheap payment maligos are involved. So what happens when a customer steps out of line? What happens when a man gets violent, refuses to pay, or otherwise causes chaos in the bishop's well-regulated machine of sin? The consequences were surprisingly swift and remarkably well organized. Imagine the scene. It's late. A foreign sailor, flush with coin from a long voyage and even more full of cheap wine, is causing trouble. He's had his turn upstairs, but now he's refusing to leave. He's shouting, making demands, and he shoves one of the women who tries to calm him down. This is the moment the system kicks into gear. This isn't just a drunken brawl, it's a direct challenge to the authority of the house. The first line of defense is the board. She is not a gentle hostess now. Her face hardens. She strides over and firmly tells the sailor to pay what he owes for the extra wine and get out. He laughs in her face and gives her a shove. Big mistake. This is not just an assault on a woman, it's an assault on the manager of a licensed establishment, an official of the bishop. The board gives a sharp, coded whistle. Immediately, the house's minder or chukkarat appears. Often a large, intimidating man, perhaps the board's husband or a hired hand. His job is to handle precisely this kind of situation. He's the muscle. He and perhaps a couple of other men grab the sailor, who is now fighting back in earnest. This is where the stew house was different from a regular tavern. A brawl in a normal tavern might go on for a while before the city watch is called. Here, in the liberty of the clink, justice was local and immediate. The board doesn't need to send a runner to the city. She has a direct line to the law of the liberty. As the minder struggles to subdue the sailor, the board might use a specific, fashionably low-tech arm system. In some accounts, it suggested that the bordess had a legal right to raise a hue and cry. This was a classic medieval legal practice. If you were the victim of a crime, you would shout, "Hugh! Hugh!" and all able-bodied citizens within earshot were eagerly obligated to stop what they were doing and help apprehend the criminal. A board's cry would bring help running from the neighboring houses. It transformed the entire community into a temporary police force. Let's say our sailor is finally subdued, his arms pinned behind his back. He's now a prisoner of the house. His fate is no longer in his own hands. The minder drags him out of the Cross Keys and hauls him down the lane to the most feared building in the Liberty, the Clink prison. This infamous prison gave its name to the entire Liberty and, eventually, to the slang term for any jail. And in a perfect example of vertical integration, it was also owned and operated by the Bishop of Winchester. The sailor has been arrested, tried, and sentenced by the same administration that sold him his pleasure just an hour before. A little-known fact about justice and the Liberty is the existence of the body court. The bishop's steward for the manor of Southwark held a regular court, specifically to deal with infractions of the Stewhouse ordinances. Our sailor would be thrown into the damp, miserable confines of the Clink to await the next session. When he was brought before the steward, the board of the Cross Keys would be there to testify against him. The charges failing to pay his bill, causing a disturbance, and assaulting a resident of a licensed house. The punishment would be a hefty fine, payable to the bishop's court. If he couldn't pay, he would languish in the Clink until his friends or his ship's captain bailed him out. Historians are still fascinated by the efficiency of this system. It was a microstate with its own police, judiciary, and penal system, all dedicated to the smooth operation of a single industry. The debate is whether this system was truly about justice. Was it about protecting the women? Or was it, once again, about protecting the business? An unruly customer disrupts the flow of commerce. He scares away other potential clients. He damages the property, the women, and the house itself. The swift punishment wasn't about moral outrage, it was about quality control and asset protection. The sailor wasn't punished for being a brute, he was punished for being a bad customer. This system of immediate, localized justice is a stark contrast to what would happen if a woman were attacked outside the Liberty. There, she would be on her own, with little help of the law taking her side. Within the walls of the Stewhouse, under the bishop's authority, she had a measure of protection that was transcational, unsentimental, but very, very real. The sailor, nursing his bruises in the cold darkness of the Clink, is a testament to the strange, paradoxical power structure of the Stews. He learned a hard lesson in the bishop's Liberty: you could pay for sin, but you couldn't get away with bad behavior. And this brings up the ultimate question about the whole framework. The sailor is locked away in the Clink. The board is back to counting her coins, and a semblance of order has returned to the Cross Keys. The swift, efficient punishment you've just witnessed forces you to confront the central, nagging question about this entire, elaborate system: who was it really designed to protect? Was this web of regulations, the price caps, the dress codes, the Lenten closures, the instant justice truly a shield for the vulnerable women trapped within it? Or was it merely a sophisticated legal cage built to protect the business, the customers, and the profits? Let's play devil's advocate for a moment and argue the case that the laws were, in their own medieval way, a form of protection for the women. Before this regulated system was codified, prostitution was a chaotic and brutal free-for-all. A woman working on her own was completely at the mercy of her clients and any strongman who decided to become her pimp. She had no legal recourse if she was beaten or cheated. The regulated stews, by contrast, offered a baseline of security: the rule against customers bringing in weapons, the prohibition on violence against the women, the legal requirement to pay upfront, the presence of a board and a minder to enforce order, the swift justice of the Liberty's own court. From this perspective, the bishop's ordinances created a workspace that was, arguably, safer than any other option available to a destitute woman. Even the rules that seem purely controlling, like the price caps, could be interpreted as a form of protection. By setting a maximum fee, the law prevented women from being accused of extortion, a common charge leveled against prostitutes in unregulated environments. The geographical quarantine, while isolating, also created a community, a space where the women were the majority and understood the local rules better than any outsider. In this light, the system looks like a flawed, deeply compromised, but nonetheless genuine attempt to manage a social problem with a modicum of order and safety. Now, let's take the opposite view, the one that many modern historians lean towards. This argument states that the primary beneficiary of the system was never the women, but the patriarchy that created it. The entire structure was designed to protect men. It protected honorable men's wives and daughters from seduction and assault by providing a designated outlet for male lust. It protected the customers by ensuring the women were, in theory, disease-free and that the prices were regulated. It protected them from false accusations of rape, as a woman in a stew house had, in the eyes of the law, already given her consent by being there. The protection offered to the women was merely a side effect, a necessary condition to keep the business running smoothly. You have to maintain your equipment if you want it to remain profitable. From this cynical or perhaps realistic viewpoint, the women were not the subjects of the law's protection, but the objects of its control. The regulations were a legal framework for managing a class of women who were seen as public property. The laws that seemed to offer safety were, in reality, about ensuring the product was reliable and the marketplace was orderly. The prohibition on violence wasn't about her bodily autonomy, it was about protecting the board's and the bishop's financial asset from being damaged. A fascinating, little-known detail that supports this argument is the legal status of the women's testimony. While a board could testify in the bishop's court against an unruly customer, the testimony of a common woman from the stews held very little weight in most other legal forums. They were considered inherently untrustworthy witnesses. So their legal protection was highly conditional and confined to the specific economic context of the liberty. The great, unresolved debate that continues amongst scholars to this day is where on this spectrum the truth lies. Was it 40% protection and 60% control? Or the other way around? The answer is likely lost to time as it depends on motivations that weren't ever written down. Did the Bishop of Winchester lie awake at night, genuinely believing he was doing God's work by providing a safe haven for these women? Or did he simply see a line item on a budget and a convenient theological justification? As you stand there, watching the mundane business of the stew house resume, you realize the answer is probably both. The system was a monstrous hybrid. It was born of a genuine, if paternalistic and misogynistic, desire for social order, but it was sustained by cold, hard cash. It offered a real, tangible protection from the chaos of the streets, but the price of that protection was the woman's freedom and autonomy. The law was both a shield and a shackle. It protected the goose from the fox, but only so the farmer could pluck its feathers and eventually take it to market. And while you're contemplating this paradox, you can't help but wonder about those who existed completely outside this cage, the ones who chose the fox over the farmer. The regulated world of the bishop's stews, with its paradoxical blend of protection and control, was not the only reality. For every licensed house operating within the liberty of the clink, there were countless other women trying to survive in the same trade, but completely outside the official system. These were the wild ones, the freelancers, the women who worked in the sprawling, uncontrolled marketplaces of sin that existed in the shadows of every medieval city. You have to understand the alternative they were built to replace and contain. Let's leave the relative order of Southwark for a moment and wander into one of London's less reputable districts on the other side of the river. A place like Smithfield, known for its livestock market and its rowdy taverns, or the crowded, labyrinthine alleys near the city docks. Here there are no striped hoods, no official price lists, no boarders leasing property from the bishop. Here, the trade is raw, illegal, and infinitely more dangerous. You see a woman standing in a darkened doorway of a cheap alehouse. She's not wearing a uniform of shame, but her clothes are ragged. She doesn't have a minder or a board. Her only protection is her own wits and, perhaps, a loose affiliation with the tavern owner who lets her use his doorway in exchange for a cut of her earnings. She is what the authorities called a common night walker, or a Flemish woman, a slang term that had less to do with her actual origin and more with the perceived licenses of foreigners. Her life is one of constant, grinding risk. Unlike Eleanor in The Bell, she has no recourse if a client turns violent or refuses to pay. There is no clink prison to drag him to, no bishop's court to hear her case. If she is robbed or beaten, the city watch would likely blame her for being there in the first place. She is a criminal by her very presence. The protection the law offers is to arrest her, whip her at a cart's tail through the streets, or put her in the public stocks for immoral living. Her clientele is different too. While the stews attracted a cross-section of society, these illegal operators often dealt with the most desperate and dangerous men. Those who couldn't afford the official houses or who were too unruly to be welcome there. The price is lower, but the risk is exponentially higher. This brings us to a fascinating and often misunderstood part of the medieval legal system: the constant war on illegal prostitution. The city authorities of London proper were obsessed with cleaning up their streets. They conducted raids, arrested women, and handed out harsh public punishments. But here's the paradox: at the same time the City of London was whipping freelance prostitutes, the Bishop of Winchester was collecting rent from his licensed ones just across the bridge. It's a stunning example of jurisdictional hypocrisy. The sin was intolerable on one side of the river, and a regulated, taxable industry on the other. A little-known detail that highlights this division comes from the city's legal records. There are numerous accounts of the Lord Mayor of London's men raiding illegal brothels, only for the operators to claim they were, in fact, under the jurisdiction of a different liberty, be it the bishops or some other local lords, creating a complex legal standoff. The city was a patchwork of competing legal zones, and the sex trade flourished in the cracks between them. So why would any woman choose this life over the relative safety of the stews? The answer, most historians agree, is a desperate kind of freedom. In the stews, a woman was bound by debt and a crushing set of rules. Outside of it, she was her own agent, however precarious that agency was. She kept what she earned after paying off whoever controlled her patch. She was not beholden to a board. She could move around, following fairs, military encampments, or pilgrim routes. It was a life of terrifying instability, but it was in some small way her own. She traded the institutional control of the stew house for the chaotic freedom of the street. The existence of this vast, illegal marketplace is what made the necessary evil argument for the stews so compelling to the authorities. They knew they could never stamp it out completely. Raids and punishments were like trying to scoop water out of the ocean with a sieve. So, the thinking went, it was better to create a licensed, contained, and observable version that they could control. The stews were not just about providing an outlet for lust, they were about competing the black market. You watch the woman in the Smithfield doorway. She negotiates with a man in hushed, hurried tones. They disappear into the darkness of the alley. There is no ceremony, no rules, no ledger. It is a moment of pure, dangerous transaction. Seeing her, you understand Eleanor's world in a new light. The cage of the stews, with its many bars, at least protected her from the wolves circling outside. The choice between these two worlds was a choice between two different kinds of hell, and as the 15th century bleeds into the 16th, a new wind is beginning to blow across Europe, a wind of religious and social change that will threaten to tear down the cage and scatter everyone, both the protected and the unprotected, into a new and uncertain world. You feel a shift in the air, a subtle change in the mood on the streets of London. It's no longer the 1460 seconds. Time has jumped forward, and you're now in the 15, 20 seconds and 30 seconds. The buildings are the same, the mud is the same, but the conversations you overhear in the taverns and marketplaces are different. People are talking about new ideas, questioning old certainties. They're talking about a German monk named Martin Luther, about the authority of the Pope, and about reforming the Church. This is the dawn of the Protestant Reformation, and this wind of change is blowing directly toward the strange, hypocritical institution of the bishop's stews. For centuries, the necessary evil argument had held firm, supported by the intellectual weight of saints and theologians. It was an argument built on a specific Catholic worldview that human beings are inherently flawed, that sin is inevitable, and that the Church's role is to manage sin through confession, penance, and absolution. The stews, in a weird way, fit perfectly into this framework. They were a place to commit a manageable sin that could later be confessed and absolved. But the new Protestant ideas challenged this at its very core. Reformers preached a different message. They emphasized a direct, personal relationship with God, unmediated by priests. And crucially, they had a much less tolerant view of institutionalized sin. For men like Luther, Calvin, and their English followers, the idea of a necessary evil was an abomination. It was a lazy, cynical compromise with the devil. There was no such thing as a good way to manage sin. Sin was to be fought, eradicated, and repented, not licensed and taxed. You can feel this new moral fervor in the air. The sermons of reform-minded preachers are fiery and direct. They attack the wealth and corruption of the old church, and the stew houses of Southwark become a perfect symbol for everything they believe is wrong. They are exhibit A in the case against the Bishop of Winchester and the entire clerical establishment. Look, they thunder from their pulpits. The so-called shepherds of Christ are not only failing to protect their flock from sin, they are profiting from it. They are landlords to vice. This new thinking found a receptive audience among London's rising merchant class. These were pious, hard-working men, often with strong Puritan leanings. They saw the stews not as a pragmatic tool for social order, but as a moral stain on their city, a source of disease, crime, and divine displeasure. They didn't want sin managed, they wanted it gone. The old argument that the stews protected their wives and daughters started to lose its power, replaced by a new fear that the very existence of such a place was inviting God's wrath upon the entire city. This shift in thinking wasn't just happening in England. Across Protestant Europe, the old municipal Frauenhäuser were also coming under attack. The new Protestant city councils of places like Augsburg and Zurich no longer saw their state-run brothels as a mark of good governance, but as a source of civic shame. One by one, they began to shut them down, replacing the old system of regulation with a new, much harsher policy of suppression and punishment for both the women and their clients. A fascinating, little-known consequence of this change was a shift in the legal definition of prostitution. Under the old system, a woman working in a licensed house was, in a sense, a legal worker in a regulated industry. Under the new Protestant legal codes, she was simply a criminal. There was no more nuance. The act itself became illegal, regardless of the context. This had a profound impact on the women, stripping away the last vestiges of their legal protection and driving the entire trade underground. Historians still debate the true impact of this reformist seal. Did closing the brothels actually reduce the amount of sin? Or did it simply make it less visible, more dangerous, and more susceptible to control by violent criminal elements? The evidence suggests the latter. The demand didn't go away. By destroying the old, flawed system of regulation, the reformers may have inadvertently created a much more brutal and exploitative black market. They drove the geese out of the bishop's flawed but relatively safe pen and into the waiting jaws of the wolf. You're standing on the Southwark side of the river, looking at the familiar signs of the Ben and the Swan. But now they seem fragile, doomed. The intellectual and religious foundations that have kept them standing for 300 years are crumbling. The arguments that once seemed so logical and pragmatic now sound like the excuses of a corrupt and decadent age. The tide of history is turning, and it is a tide that threatens to sweep the stews, the Brothels, and all the Winchester Geese away for good. All it needs is a single, powerful figure to give the final push. And that figure is about to take the throne. The air is thick with more than just the usual London fog, it's thick with political tension. You are now in the year 1546. The fiery sermons of the reformers have done their work, and the political landscape has been shattered. The man on the throne is no friend to the old ways of the church. It is King Henry VII, a monarch who, in his quest for a male and absolute power, has broken with Rome, dissolved the monasteries, and declared himself the supreme head of the church in England. His motivations were more political and personal than pious, but the result was a seismic shift in the balance of power. The old authority of the bishops was broken. The Bishop of Winchester, once a mighty prince of the church who answered only to the Pope, is now just another subject of the king. His lands, his courts, his special liberties all now exist only at the king's pleasure. The strange, semi-independent legal status of the Manor of Southwark and its infamous stews is an anachronism, a relic of a bygone era that Henry is systematically dismantling. For years, the reformers cautioned in the city of London have been petitioning the king to do something about the abominable and foul stairs. They presented them as a hotbed of sedition, a source of disease that could threaten the royal court, and most importantly, a symbol of the popish corruption that the new English church had supposedly left behind. But the pressure mounted. The stews were a constant embarrassment. How could the new Reformed Church of England, with the king as its head, continue to tolerate and profit from the very same institution that had been a symbol of the old church's hypocrisy? The Bishop of Winchester was still the landlord, and the whole arrangement stank of the past. It was a loose thread in the new tapestry of power that Henry was weaving, and he was a man who hated loose threads. And so the day finally came. You were standing in a crowd on the high street in Southwark when a royal herald, flanked by the king's men-at-arms, unrolls a scroll. His voice rings out, clear and imperious, over the hubbub of the street. He reads a royal proclamation. By order of His Royal Majesty, King Henry VII, Defender of the Faith and Supreme Head of the Church of England, the stew houses of Southwark are to be suppressed, all of them, effective immediately. The signs taken down, the occupants evicted. The practice of licensed prostitution in the liberty is, after more than 3 centuries, declared illegal. A stunned silence falls over the crowd, followed by a wave of murmurs. This isn't a Lenten closure. This is permanent. The institution that had been a landmark of London life for longer than anyone could remember, a place their fathers and their grandfathers had known, was gone, with a few words on a piece of parchment. You watch as the king's men, accompanied by the now powerless officials of the bishop, go from door to door. They stride into the Bell, the Swan, the Cross Geese. The symbolic signs are torn down and splintered in the street. The Brothels, yesterday the powerful, licensed managers of a recognized business, are today just keepers of illegal dens of vice. They are told to clear out. Then come the women. One by one, or in small, bewildered groups, they are forced out into the lane. Eleanor, or a woman just like her, now 30 years older than when we first met her, steps out into the daylight, blinking. She carries a small bundle with her few possessions. She is no longer a Winchester Goose, a semi-legal worker under the dubious protection of a bishop. She is no longer an object of regulation, one of the most vulnerable categories of person in today's society. A fascinating, unpoignant detail from the historical accounts of this closure is the reaction of the public. While the reformers and city officials celebrated a great moral victory, many ordinary Londoners lamented the decision. They saw it not as a triumph of piety, but as a foolish and impractical act. A contemporary chronicler, Charles W. Rio de Sly, wrote that all the stews on the bankside were put down by the king's commandments, which was a great loss to many a man. It's a typically pragmatic, worldly London sentiment. They weren't necessarily sad about the loss of sin, but about the disruption to a familiar, if sordid, part of the city's ecosystem. The great debate among historians is about Henry's real motivation. Was this a genuine act of moral reform, driven by his new role as the head of a Protestant nation? Or was it simply a power move, a final nail in the coffin of the bishop's independent authority, a way to seize control of a valuable piece of real estate and its legal jurisdiction? Given Henry's track record, it was almost certainly a mixture of both. He achieved a moral victory that pleased the reformers, while simultaneously consolidating his own power and authority. The doors are barred. The signs are broken. The Brothels are silenced. The king's proclamation has been carried out. The stews are dead. But as you watch the women huddling in the street, a new, urgent question arises, a question that the king's proclamation made no attempt to answer. What happens now? Where will they go? The royal proclamation has been read, the signs have been splintered, and the doors of the stew houses are barred and bolted. A cold, unnatural quiet settles over the lanes of the liberty of the clink. The king's men, their work done, march back across the bridge, leaving a social and economic vacuum in their wake. You are left standing amidst the fallout, watching the human debris of this great act of moral reform. The central, unanswered question hangs heavy in the air. Where did the Winchester Geese go? The proclamation made no provision for them. There was no resettlement plan, no job training program, no severance package. The king had surgically removed the tumor of the stews, but had left the wound open and gaping. Hundreds of women, the historical estimates vary, but it was a significant population, were rendered homeless and jobless in a single afternoon. You watch them as they begin to disperse. Some, the younger and more resilient ones, perhaps simply cross the river. They melt into the sprawling, anonymous neighborhoods of London, seeking out very same shadowy existence as the illegal, freelance prostitutes they were once protected from. They know the trade. They just no longer have a licensed place to practice it. The closure of the official stews didn't end prostitution, it merely decentralized it. It spread it, like a spilled inkpot, into every dark corner and alley of the metropolis. The problem wasn't solved, it was just made invisible to the official eye. Other women, particularly the older ones like the Eleanor we've imagined, faced a much bleaker future. Too old to easily attract clients on the street, and with no other skills, their options were terrifyingly limited. Some might have tried to find work as laundry women or domestic servants, but their reputation from the bankside would have preceded them. Who would hire an ex-prostitute to work in their home, around their family? A sad and little-known fact is that many of these women likely ended up as alewives in the seedier taverns, serving drinks and providing companionship for a pittance and a place to sleep by the fire. Others, with nowhere else to go, would have become beggars, relying on the charity of the church parishes. The records of London's hospitals and poorhouses from the years following 1546 show an increase in destitute single women seeking aid. The moral cleansing of Southwark led directly to a social welfare crisis. What about the boardess? These formidable businesswomen, stripped of their licenses and their properties, would have reacted in different ways. Some, who had been shrewder with their money, might have had enough to buy a tavern or an inn, continuing their trade in a less overt, but still profitable manner. They would have taken their best geese with them, setting up new, smaller, and completely illegal houses of ill repute. The system wasn't destroyed, it was just broken up into smaller, harder to track pieces. The state had given up its monopoly, and now the free market, in its most brutal form, took over. Historians are still tracing the ripples of this event. One school of thought argues that the closure of the stews, and similar actions across Protestant Europe, ultimately worsened the lives of the women involved. By removing the flawed but existing structures of regulation and protection, the reformers abandoned these women to the much harsher realities of the unregulated street and the criminal underworld. The freedom they were given was the freedom to starve, to be arrested, or to be controlled by violent pimps rather than a rule-bound board. Another perspective, however, suggests that the closure, while brutal in the short term, was a necessary step in a long, slow evolution of social attitudes. The end of the necessary evil model, they argue, was the first step toward a world where women were no longer officially designated as public property for the convenience of men. It was a chaotic, painful, and deeply imperfect transition, but it closed the door on a particularly grim chapter of state-sanctioned exploitation. You look at the now silent doorway of the Cross Keys. The paint is already starting to peel. A stray dog sniffs at the step. The energy, the life, the grim commerce of the place has vanished. It's a ghost. The system that had endured for over 300 years, that had survived plagues and wars and peasant revolts, was brought down not by a peasant spike, but by a king's pen and a shift in ideology. The grand, strange, hypocritical experiment was over, but the legacy of it, the ghost of the idea that sin can be managed, contained, and profited from, would linger for centuries. And as you contemplate this empty shell, you begin to reflect on the entire bizarre journey. You pull your cloak a little tighter, the damp chill of the London evening seeping into your bones. The alley where the Cross Keys once bustled is now just another dark, empty lane. The ghosts of the Winchester Geese have dispersed into the city shadows. Your journey through this strange, forgotten chapter of history is coming to an end, and it's time to step back and process the bizarre landscape you've just traveled through. What you've witnessed is more than just a story about prostitution. It's a story about the fundamental, often contradictory, ways a society tries to organize itself. You saw how an institution, the church that preached absolute morality, could, with breathtaking mental gymnastics, become the landlord of a business built on what it defined as mortal sin. You saw how secular authorities, the city councils of places like Augsburg, could take that same sin and turn it into a sterile, efficient, and profitable public utility like sanitation or waterworks. You've walked through a world where sin was not just a private moral failing, but a public commodity, something to be regulated, taxed, and contained for the greater good. The necessary evil philosophy, which seems so alien and hypocritical to us, was, for them, a perfectly logical solution to the intractable problem of human desire. It was social engineering on a grand scale, an attempt to build a canal for a river they knew they could never dam. You've seen the rules, the endless, meticulous regulations that governed every aspect of this world. The price caps, the dress codes, the mandatory holidays, the ban on weapons. These weren't the laws of a chaotic underworld, they were the bylaws of a highly structured, officially sanctioned industry. A fascinating tidbit to cap it all off: in some European cities, the official brothel was even granted its own codific institution. It was a business with a brand. But beneath the grand ideas and the strange trivia, you've also glimpsed the human cost. You've seen the world through Eleanor's eyes: the loss of freedom, the constant debt, the public shame of the striped hood, the ever-present risk of disease, and the slim, almost fairy-tale-like hope of escape. You saw that the protection offered by the system was always secondary to the profits and the convenience of the men who designed it. The law was a cage, and whether its bars were iron or gold, it was a cage nonetheless. The ultimate fate of the stews serves as a powerful lesson in how profoundly a shift in ideas can reshape the physical and social world. The Reformation didn't just change how people prayed, it changed how they organized their cities and how they defined crime. The closure of the stews wasn't just an act of piety, it was a political act that demonstrated the final victory of the state over the old, independent power of the church. It swept away a system that was, by then, a relic of a medieval worldview. Historians to this day continue to pick apart the legacy of this strange institution. There is no simple moral to the story. Was the regulated system better or worse than the chaotic black market that replaced it? It's an impossible question to answer, a grim calculation of one form of suffering against another. There is no consensus, only a continuing, fascinated debate about one of history's most startling and sustained experiments in social hypocrisy. The story of the bishop's stews and the Frauenhauser is a stark reminder that the past is a truly foreign country. Their solutions to timeless human problems can seem bizarre, cruel, or even comical to us. But they were the product of their own logic, their own fears, and their own deeply held beliefs. To walk through their world is to see our own in a new light, to question our own certainties, and to recognize the complex, often contradictory ways we still try to draw lines between what is permissible and what is forbidden, what is a private matter and what is a public concern. The ghosts of the Winchester Geese have much to teach us, not just about their world, but about our own. The alley is quiet now. The sounds of the 16th century have faded, replaced by the soft, familiar hum of your own room. The journey is over. Let the details of that other time begin to soften, to blur at the edges, like a watercolor painting left in the gentle rain. The sharp figures of the board, the bishop's man, and the woman in the striped hood recede, becoming part of the deep, flowing river of things that once were. Feel the tension release from your shoulders. Let go of the cold stone walls of Augsburg, and the damp, muddy lanes of Southwark. The weight of their world is not yours to carry. You were just a visitor, a silent observer drifting through the corridors of time. Now you are drifting back to the safe harbor of your own bed, on the gentle tide of your own breathing, in and out. Imagine the stories you've heard tonight as distant stars in a vast, dark sky. Each one a pinpoint of light from a world long gone. You don't need to hold on to them or analyze them any longer. Just watch them twinkle from a great and peaceful distance. They are part of the great, silent turning of history, and you are part of the great, silent turning of the night. The need to understand gives way to a simple, peaceful feeling of stillness. The paradoxes resolve into a quiet acceptance. Everything is as it was, and you are drifting, safely, into the soft and welcoming landscape of your own dreams. The end of the article. Good night.